Okay, I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Troy Lanigan. I'm president of the Canada Strong and Free Network. I want to welcome you to our last exchange call of 2020, a year I think many of us will be happy to see in the rearview mirror. But I want to especially welcome those that are joining us from outside the country. I know we do have some folks from the UK on that are joining us, so welcome. A couple of things to get started. First of all, we encourage you to use the chat function. You can comment on the chat function as the speakers are talking about the subjects that we're dealing with today. You don't have to use the chat function. A lot of people email me after and say they find the chat function annoying. You can push that button on the bottom that says chat or push it again to make sure that it's off. You don't have to use it. If you have a question, we prefer that it go into the Q&A box, not into the chat function. So please use that Q&A box. I'll be looking at it during the discussion, trying to summarize some of the questions, and then I'll have, hopefully, we'll have some questions toward the end of the discussion today. Finally, everyone always asks, and yes, this session will be recorded. In fact, I hope it's a great resource to use on the topic of CANZUK amongst many advocates here and around the world. So I actually first heard about CANZUK, not in Canada. I actually heard about it the first time on a trip to the UK a couple of years ago. When I got back, connected with some supporters here and have been watching the issue over the past while. It was passed as a party resolution by the Conservative Party of Canada. And I think most recently what's interesting is Erin O'Toole had it as a key plank in his platform during his successful leadership bid. So we would say that CANZUK is a household term yet. But it has some great advocates in this country. And I want to thank James Skinner. I want to thank Roy Grinchpan, especially, who has been instrumental in pushing for this discussion and helping us put together such a fantastic panel. So thank you to everyone for joining us. I want to thank the panelists, especially, for taking their time and sharing their expertise. And with that, I've asked James Skinner, who's the chief executive of CANZUK International, because his expertise is far greater than mine, obviously, on this topic, to moderate our discussion. And James will be coming back to me in a while as I'm keeping track of the questions and some of the discussion that's going on. So I hope you enjoy the next while. James, welcome. Thanks for doing this. And over to you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Troy. I appreciate being here. I will be the moderator today for today's panel discussion, which I'm super excited to be here, delighted to be here, because our guests no doubt are going to provide tremendous valuable insights and expertise in what they know and how CANZUK is going to be beneficial, not only just here in Canada, but also as well across Australia, New Zealand, and the UK as well. So for those who follow CANZUK and understand all about it, thank you for being here today and welcome. For those of you perhaps on tuning in who don't know anything about CANZUK, it's great to have you here. I have no doubt the next hour or so is going to be incredibly informative for you. And even if you're tuning in and you are maybe even anti-CANZUK or you just don't like the idea of it, that's fine. But thank you also for being here. And hopefully today, our guests will provide you with a lot of information that you can, take away, absorb, and who knows, maybe even it'll change your mind about CANZUK and you can see it the way that we do, that it's going to be really beneficial for our four countries moving forward. So for those of you perhaps tuning in who don't know much about CANZUK, I'll give you a brief overview of what it really is all about. CANZUK, of course, is an acronym for the countries Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And I believe anyone on the call can correct me on this, I'm not entirely sure, but I believe it was a term originally coined in the 1960s. By who, I'm not entirely sure, but it was originally just a simple acronym that sort of described the way that these four countries would work together, especially within the United Nations Assembly. And this was often to the benefit and sometimes the detriment of other members, but these countries were so like-minded that they would always seem to vote the same way. And of course, the slang acronym CANZUK developed, but it somewhat lay dormant for the better part of about 60 years or so, only really used in higher ends of diplomatic circles. Until 2015, when I founded the organization CANZUK International. And the sole goal of CANZUK, just from my own personal experiences and tremendous public support for it, was really to change that acronym from just being a simple reference, a simple acronym reference of these countries, to something much more, whereby these countries could be independent and sovereign, but act together on the international stage to provide so many opportunities for our citizens and so many benefits for our economies, work together on foreign policy, and so many other initiatives all in between as well. So like most ideas as well, it really came out of the blue for me. It was when I was in Australia in 2011. I was living and working there. And like many other great ideas as well that happened, it actually happened in a bar when I was actually having a few drinks with a New Zealand friend of mine. And of course, us Brits and us New Zealanders, we do like a drink or two now and then. And as I was living in Australia, my visa was coming to an end. I'd been there for about 2 years or so. And my New Zealand friend said to me, you know, it's a shame that you have to leave Australia, when I wanted to stay there. And of course I agreed. And I said to him, so when does your visa expire? When do you have to go back to New Zealand? And he just sort of just looked at me point blank and said, oh, I don't, I can stay in Australia for as long as I want. And I was taken aback by this. I was like, so how come? Have you got sponsorship, or did you marry an Australian girl overnight or something that I don't know about? And he said, no, it's just simply because I am a New Zealander and I can live and work indefinitely in Australia if I want. So my mind was completely blown by this, and I had to press further and ask him questions about this. But as the conversation developed, he simply informed me that Australia and New Zealand have this mutual agreement between each other, whereby citizens of New Zealand can live and work freely in Australia indefinitely if they so choose. And citizens of Australia can live and work indefinitely in New Zealand, providing they don't have any criminal records, any sort of terrorist affiliations, any infectious health conditions that could pose a safety threat to societies at large. And he said there's just this mutual trust between our two countries that really benefits not only us as citizens, but also businesses, employers. It provides tremendous opportunities for citizens in Australia and New Zealand all around. And I thought this was a tremendous, tremendous idea, that how two countries, two like-minded allies, came together to essentially create this sort of, these agreements between each other, whereby we trust you, you trust us. Let's provide these benefits for our citizens, for our businesses, for our economies, and work together in these ways while also staying independent sovereign nations. And I thought it was a tremendous idea. And so that idea stuck with me for a little bit of time until I came to Canada in 2013. And a similar situation unfolded here in Canada when I arrived, being that there were lots of Australians, lots of New Zealanders, lots of Brits in Canada, especially in Vancouver. If anybody goes to Whistler, you'll see tremendous amounts of Australians up there because they love the skiing and the winter weather. And it was incredibly heartbreaking to see that at the end of their visas, these people who come to call Canada home, who got great jobs, who lived and worked here, they paid their taxes, they were law-abiding citizens, they volunteered with local charities and hospitals. Some really good friends of mine had to say goodbye to a country that they had grown to call home because at the end of the day, their visas had expired. And I thought there was just two things really wrong with this. I thought, you know, this is sad, not only to see them say goodbye and, you know, had to see them pack up their lives, but also as well the tremendous opportunities that Canada was missing out on by having these skilled workers here who really wanted to integrate, spoke the same language, you know, paid their taxes, were law-abiding, were model citizens essentially, but they were simply told to go back to where they came from because a piece of paper on a visa told them that they had to. And then the final straw for me as well, and I'm sure Dan Hannon, who's on the line here, can attest to this too. Every single time I went back to the UK, where I'm from, I would land at Gatwick or Heathrow Airport, and I would always see two lines of people. One would be a line of EU citizens, whether it be Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Lithuanian, whatever it may be. And just with a simple flash of a passport, they could easily go through customs immigration in the UK. Quite frankly, without having any linguistic ties to the UK, really without having any historical ties to the UK, very few cultural ties, no ancestral ties. And yet the other line to the left of me always would be filled with Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders coming to the UK to visit family, friends. They have the same linguistic ties, ancestral ties, cultural ties with us. And they would have to line up for the better part of 2 hours to come into the UK just to have a customs and borders official stamp a visa for them and tell them you have 3 to 6 months, depending, to leave this country. Otherwise, the British government is going to break down your door and deport you. And I just thought, you know what, we've got this completely the wrong way around. We've got this all wrong. As Troy, as you pointed out, Erin O'Toole is the leader of the Conservative Party here in Canada, but he has rightly pointed out that, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, we have physically lived together, fought together, and died together in some of the greatest wars that this planet has presented us. And yet, when it comes to modern foreign policy today in the 21st century, we seem to have lost that unique kinship that we once had many, many years ago. And so the purpose of me founding CANZUK International is just because of my own experiences and just because it just seems like an idea whose time has come, is that I felt like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK have so much to offer in terms of how mutually alike they are, in terms of their relationship, in terms of their natural alliance. And I feel like these countries, these four countries, can do so much more together rather than acting alone. So for CANZUK International, I simply developed the organization to promote three main objectives, and that was to reintroduce reciprocal migration between these four countries, providing there are stipulations in place, such as not allowing those with criminal records to travel, or those who might pose a risk in terms of national security or health or whatever it may be. Providing citizens meet strict security, health, and character requirements, they are free to travel in that way. Trade as well, whereby these countries can trade between each other. There can also be mutual skills recognition, whereby a professional in one of these countries can live and work in any of the other countries as well, without having to undertake arduous retraining and re-exercise programs and spending thousands of dollars trying to prove that they know what they already know. And also foreign policy cooperation as well, whereby these countries can work together on the international stage to stand together against often authoritarian regimes which pose a threat to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, such as North Korea or China in that way. So for me, it's been the better part of 5 years advocating for this, but I truly believe that the future of our four countries is in acting together rather than acting alone for these principles, which can really provide so many benefits for our citizens, our economies, our businesses, and everything else in between. So enough from me anyway. I don't want to take up too much more time. We're all here to hear from the panelists and get their expertise. So I'm excited to hear from them. So Brent, you're on the line. I really want to hear your perspective about CANZUK, what it means to you as a fellow Canadian, how CANZUK can benefit Canada, what it means in terms of trade diplomacy. Super excited to have you on today. So thank you for being here. So the floor is yours, my friend. Take it away.
Thank you, James. Before I get into it, I want to thank the Canada Strong and Free Network for hosting this event and giving every one of us an opportunity to talk about CANZUK, something that I think we're all passionate about. But before I get into it, I want to thank you specifically, James, because a lot of us have been working on the CANZUK file for a long time, but I think that your efforts should be singled out as being the most effective in getting it to the point where we actually can have a forum like this. Your work, your ability to popularize it through CANZUK International is due in no small measure this event. So I do want to say a personal thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Of course, CANZUK mechanically it would be agreements on free trade and free movement between the four countries, but I'm always reminded of the saying that something can be more than the sum of its parts. And I think that's something that I would like to focus on. And there was a few years ago, the American cable network AMC had a drama called Halt and Catch Fire. It was one that I liked, but apparently a lot of people didn't because it got canceled. But it was the story of the development of the personal computer and the internet told through the journey of lead characters. So it went through their ups and downs, their breakthroughs, and their setbacks. They had one character on the show called Joe McMillan, and that was loosely based on Steve Jobs. He uttered a phrase in the first episode that got repeated in the series finale. And he said, computers aren't the thing. They're the thing that gets us to the thing. And I think that in many ways encapsulates what CANZUK is. I mean, mechanically, legal text negotiated between member states. And for those people who are focused on that, it can be an end in and of itself. But the value of the key isn't in the design of the detail, but from the door it unlocks. And I think today, because we live in an increasingly multipolar world, and China's economic and geopolitical powers growing, we're also faced with the realization that both the United States and Europe, who have been traditionally leaders for liberal democratic values, they're turning inward politically. They're seized more by domestic considerations. We just have to look at what happened south of the border. Americans are going to be focused more on resolving tensions that cut across racial, cultural, economic, geographic lines. And then the European Union is going to be focused more on issues of unity and integration amongst the remaining member states. Domestic considerations always override external concerns, but having them focus more inward at a time when we are seeing the rise of a peer competitor to the existing model is very problematic. And it should be a concern for all of us, whether or not you are an adherent to CANZUK, because nature abhors a vacuum and it won't remain. So the challenge is who's going to fill that vacuum, because that's going to determine bigger issues for the rest of our generation. And if you look at what's coming out of Beijing right now, they've openly talked about wanting to have an alternative to the status quo, which would be the Western consensus. And given that foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy, we can only assume that this new alternative is going to reflect the characteristics and the interests of their domestic policy. Everything from Hong Kong to the plight of the Uyghurs to the still unresolved captivity of the two Michaels, this so-called wolf warrior style of diplomacy, even that terrible doctored image of an Australian soldier that was tweeted out by a Chinese official. These are examples that come from a country that aspires to be first among equals and set the tone and tenor for global relations in the latter part of this century. So, we don't have an option. Doing nothing assures this outcome. But if we argue that we're in an inevitable decline relative to the PRC, that's just doing nothing made palatable by denial. So we do need a new pole in this multipolar world. We need some rallying point for those committed to liberal democratic values, individual freedom, free speech, free markets, human rights, and the rule of law. Now, that's not overstating the importance of CANZUK, but if CANZUK represents a new liberal democratic pole that holds to its ideals without compromise, and we can do great things for all our citizens and make common cause with like-minded allies, we're going to bring something into the world that's more valuable than export data or ease of passage through airport customs line. So I think that there are reasons why people support CANZUK, and they're obvious: jobs and opportunity. But again, it's so much more than that. There was a previous generation that fought the Cold War, and the Soviet Union argued that they had the better development model, but we challenged them. And we said liberal democratic values, the liberal democratic model was superior, and we challenged them in the field of ideas, and we won. And so, although times have changed, we really need to revisit that. And, as far as I'm concerned, CANZUK has the opportunity to do its stated task and so much more. So flipping back to the quote from that TV show, CANZUK in many ways is like the computer. It's more than the thing. It's the thing that actually can get us to the thing. And I think that if we focus on CANZUK in that respect, we can see the potential that is more than just the movement of people and the movement of goods. And that's the thing that excites me about CANZUK, and I'm sure that's what excites a lot of other people about it. So again, thank you to the Canada Strong and Free Network, and thank you, James, for doing this. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. It's been a passion for so long. I'm just gratified by the opportunity.
No, it's great to have you on, Brent, as well. Thank you very much, and providing your expertise on the issue. And I think you've hit the nail on the head there as well, in terms of how CANZUK offers so much more than just the simple, the three issues of migration and trade. There's actually so much more in terms of what it can offer in the future. So I want to bring in as well Dr. Kelly Sundberg. And Kelly, I believe your expertise lies in really security and policing. But I want to get your take as well on how CANZUK can be beneficial for these countries, and also as well, if there is reciprocal migration between these countries inevitably, then what that means in terms of a security and a safety environment for the citizens of these countries. So please, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks a lot, James, and thank you for having me, and a big thanks to Roy for getting me on today, and James for setting up. This is unbelievable. Yeah, so I'm gonna speak well, just a bit about myself. I'm a professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, in the Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies department. I also hold adjunct positions, one at the University of Calgary, and also one at the University of Adelaide in Australia. So my academic career takes me in Canada and in Australia. And prior to I did my doctorate degree at Monash in Melbourne. So I'm Australian educated, as well as having my master's and undergrad here in Canada. Prior to my academic career, I served 15 years with what's today the Canada Border Services Agency, and worked in customs and immigration separately before 9/11 and before the CBSA was formed. And I was one of the policy people who helped set up the Canada Border Services Agency back in the day. So specific, and my area of research is specific to migration and border security. In thinking about CANZUK, this notion of bringing the four nations of the Five Eyes together, we look at the benefits that we've seen over the decades through the Five Eyes, and I understand some of the other panelists will be speaking on the Five Eyes, but under the Five Eyes, or related to that, is the Border Five, which is a focus between Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States with respect to customs issues. We have the Five Country Conference, which is the same five countries that are looking at matters with regards to migration and immigration. And then we have the Five Nation Passport Group, which coordinates our visas and our passport design and security, and so that we can flow more easily through countries already. And that's the border management under that Five Nations Passport Program. Now, these programs over the last few years, I mean, they kind of, sometimes there's quite a lot of attention. Sometimes they sort of wane in their utility and the coordination, and we've seen that they've diminished somewhat over the last little while. But if we through this with CANZUK, we'd have the opportunity to better coordinate and harmonize efforts between the four countries with respect to human smuggling and trafficking, smuggling and the global trafficking of drugs, weapons, and other contraband, and then other transnational crimes such as money laundering, cybersecurity, child exploitation. We've seen in recent months the Australian Federal Police and the RCMP working hand in hand to address child exploitation through child pornography, for instance. And then more the fact that we're all online and a lot of us working from home and not getting out as much anymore. Thinking about pandemic management and control. I mean, we've seen this in the past with coordination between nations at border controls with regards to SARS or MERS, mad cow through the movement of goods, the noxious weeds. There's all sorts of aspects of things, and now we have COVID, of course. So thinking of our ability to very quickly and effectively put in controls when we need them. That when we also think of, specifically, I think New Zealand and Canada, where New Zealand being next to Australia and Canada being next to the United States, where we are sort of the satellites, if you will. Although as a Canadian, I don't like to think of it that way, but I mean, the reality is that we are. That is the reality. But by having our ability to coordinate our efforts through conducting intelligence operations specific to border and national security and migration control, the best practices in how we address enforcement, how we manage our borders with technology. So how we think about issues of concerns that we've seen throughout the world, but specifically with Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United Kingdom, with Huawei hardware that's coming into our cellular networks and these sort of things. Joint training and operations where we can better work together. Like we do see this, the benefits that we've seen in Europe with Frontex, but we could see this. Actually, I think it would be improved because of the global scale, the having across the Pacific, the Atlantic. I mean, it would be quite something to see this. And then this might sound a little strange for some, but it would also allow better protection domestically for each nation against possible criminal threats from the others. So this would be, for instance, sex offenders. We would prohibit the opportunity, the ability that currently exists. I mean, legally it's prohibited, but in practice it can happen, where sex offenders, convicted criminals who might be on a parole or probation situation, fugitives or others from moving between the four nations. Currently, the Canada has agreements with the United States to address these concerns, but we don't see this. And James, as you were talking about all the Kiwis and Aussies in Whistler and every other ski hill in Canada, we see them out in Banff too. You know, these are all wonderful young people, and none of them have any criminal concerns, of course. But should we have someone who poses a concern, each other's name through this arrangement, we could have greater protections for one another, which would also help protect our communities. So just in conclusion, I know as Roy did specify, because I could talk for about the next 10 hours straight, as a good professor can. The event, you know, through this arrangement, I really see it as a really important mechanism to advance the core tenets of Westminster democracy, promote and advance our shared views on human and civil rights. It truly provides us an opportunity to advance the educational opportunities. As I said, you know, I'm both Australian educated as well as a faculty member at an Australian university. That opportunity for cultural exchange, for technological advances and coordination, thinking of advancements of each country's Indigenous peoples, from those in Australia to Canada to New Zealand, that we have so many opportunities that this can see. And we would definitely be stronger. And I think that this would be not just an economic benefit to our country, but you know, would be a great security benefit also. So thank you for entertaining my very quick talk there.
No, thank you, Kelly. Really appreciate it. Appreciate you being here as well, taking time out of your busy schedule. Yeah, I think again, you know, you sort of addressed what Brent said in that, you know, obviously CANZUK can go so much further than just simple trade and migration agreement. There's so many more opportunities ahead of it as well, but also as well, it's really refreshing to have somebody of your expertise sort of address the issue that a lot of people on social media and a lot of people who perhaps don't know a lot about CANZUK think that this will just create a lot of criminal opportunities, when in reality, it'll actually do the very opposite. It'll actually make our countries more secure, safer, and, you know, even though easier to live in between the four of us, it'll be, you know, tremendous for security collaboration in that sense. So I want to take it to a sort of a different angle now in terms of, David, I'm going to bring you in. So you are part of the Consumer Choice Centre here in Toronto. We're probably just, I don't know where in Toronto you are, I'm in downtown, but we're probably not too far from each other, and it's freezing cold here to say the least. But I'm curious to get your take in terms of what you think, sort of like piggybacking off what Brent and Kelly was saying in terms of the opportunities that CANZUK presents moving forward. What you think from your perspective CANZUK can offer in terms of opportunities for the average consumer, say in Canada, or indeed across these countries, if there were perhaps to say a trade deal organized between them. So the floor is yours, my friend.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you very much for organizing this event, to Troy and Roy as well. I think this is a great discussion to be had. It's one that is very important, which is obviously made more important by the fact that there does seem to be some political appetite for this. So this is not just something that is an idea where we are sitting back and chatting about hypotheticals. This is something that politicians in all four countries across different parties have expressed interest in pursuing. And so I'll explain the benefit to consumers, and I'll try and answer a couple questions that I've seen already in the Q&A box that are relevant to my area of expertise. So Bob Copeland asked, okay, but how do I know how this specifically benefits each country? So I won't talk about this in any real nationalistic sense. I'll talk about this on the consumer level, and I'll break it down in the following way. So the first is a common market for goods. Why does that matter? Well, it means that Canadian consumers will have more choice on their shelves and with the products that they're able to buy. I've made that argument time and time again, and a lot of people have said, well, we already have, like, globalization has happened. We already have access to goods from all over the world. And that's true. But CANZUK represents the opportunity to have those goods at more competitive prices. And that's where the real value of free trade comes in. So yes, we can get goods from all over the world. We can certainly get goods from the countries that are involved in this agreement. But by doing so under a free trade agreement where you have the free movement of goods and you have either a plan to significantly reduce tariffs or eliminate them altogether, what you do is you rapidly increase the choices that Canadian consumers or British consumers or Australian consumers or New Zealand consumers have. And that creates more competition, and that creates more choice. And ultimately that leads, in my opinion, to better outcomes. And one kind of side externality of that, which we've seen very much so in the progress of globalization, is a real depression on prices with the increase of competition, being able to tame things like inflation, especially surprise inflation. These are all external benefits that we now have because we live in a global world. And using CANZUK as a means to better connect these four markets through the movement of goods builds on that, recognizes the success of the globalized experiment over the last 30, 40 years, and really solidifies that relationship. Now, one question I've seen in the chat box from Dave Jorkman asks if it's smart for Canada to collaborate with Australia and New Zealand, given their new economic ties with China. It's a great question. And I think the answer is absolutely yes. It's absolutely yes for a few reasons. So first, I don't think that we should engage in a trade war with China on hard goods or soft goods or hard goods, however you describe them, meaning the things that are sold to us in grocery stores. If we're talking about software and Huawei, I certainly think that there's conversation to be had about limitations. But more importantly, by collaborating with Australia and New Zealand and the United Kingdom, it gives us more of a leverage point on the expectations we have for the Chinese Communist Party in their relationship with these four countries. And what I mean by that is we get to better discuss, with more weight behind it, human rights abuses. We get to better address the plight of the Uyghurs. We get to better address the plight of the ordinary Chinese person who's being terrorized by a all-encompassing government that essentially controls many aspects of the average citizen's life. And so by coming together as a group, we have much more weight. And a lot of people, a lot of commentators in the Canadian space have said, well, what are we supposed to do about the two Michaels? There's really not much we can do. Canada is such a small country. Well, if we have Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia, all of a sudden our footprint is much bigger. Our trade power is much bigger. And that allows for us to help tilt the scales in terms of ensuring that the prospect of free trade also further liberalizes the Chinese economy, but also their political system, which is the problem. Now, there's also the argument for the common market in services. So that benefits Canadian consumers in the same way that it does for goods. Should an IT provider from Australia be able to help you in Canada build a website? Of course. Should a management consultant be able to take on, in Canada, be able to take on UK clients? Of course. And I think that they should be able to do so without added bureaucracy and paperwork. And what's important here is that in many senses, this already exists. And I think a lot of us who are working from home have started maybe to realize that some of these labor market restrictions are outdated. So if you worked in an office and your place of employment is now saying, well, you can work from home, you start to go, well, maybe I could work from a beach in Mexico, or maybe I can move to Victoria, enjoy a better winter climate. And so we're starting to see that um, accelerate more than it already does. And so a common market for services between these countries acknowledges that reality, acknowledges the world that we live in, and solidifies the fact that, yeah, you should be able to acquire services from all of these countries, and we should be able to do so as freely and quickly as possible. Now, one question which was from Kevin Young, asked about the cost of air travel between these countries, which is a really good question. Yes, this I think would impact the cost of air travel. In my view, a CANZUK agreement would be or would slowly chip away at cabotage rules, which are part of the reason why it's so incredibly and insanely expensive to travel from Canada and within Canada. Again, very simple example. Should British Airways be able to fly from London to Toronto en route to Vancouver? 100%. I think if you polled most Canadians, they would say yes, and they would be surprised that they can't. So I think that CANZUK represents an opportunity to chip away at some of those barriers as well. Ability to travel. Anyone who enjoys traveling the world, anyone who has traveled and has had to go through the process of applying for a formal visa. Obviously, you keep in mind for criminal background checks and infectious diseases and all of the appropriate actions that a government can do to keep its citizens safe. But I do think that acknowledging that we should have free movement is a fantastic step in the right direction. On the consumer side, in terms of what you do for work, it drastically increases your employment opportunities. And when we have things like license reciprocity, you remove a huge barrier to work. And I'll use an example of the oil patch in Alberta. So we've seen the oil patch have all sorts of issues and influxes in employment. Should those highly trained professionals be able to go and work in the Weald Basin in the UK's oil and gas industry? Of course they should. And let's make that as easy as possible. Everybody benefits from that situation. If the UK needs additional support in terms of skilled labor, well, we have an industry that's struggling here in Canada, obviously in Alberta. It would be great if they could take those jobs. And the same goes in reverse. If we use the example of Australian mining. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. And then in conclusion, because I know I'm running out of time, the big thing here is I think CANZUK was a great idea before COVID, and I think that CANZUK is an even greater idea post-COVID. And I say that because we need to focus on economic growth. We're in an incredible hole. All four countries are in an incredible hole. And I use this as a reference point. So in 1993, it was predicted that the formation of the EU common market would grow the economy between 4.5% and 6.5%. In reality, from the common market alone, GDP growth as a result of the EU was more around 8 or 9%. So this is extremely promising data. Obviously, the UK is bigger, but I can hear a lot of skeptics say, well, the UK just left the EU. Why would we want to engage in any sort of agreement like that? And the answer is CANZUK takes the benefits of a common market, the benefits of the EU, without a central government, without some over-encroaching multinational regulatory board, without a common currency. So it takes what the European experiment, in my eyes, could and should have been, and says, okay, well, that worked. That generated a lot of prosperity. We don't need the rest of the silliness that the Brits were rightfully displeased by. And let's move forward and let's build a pro-growth strategy. And so that's my hope for Canada moving forward in the context of CANZUK.
Perfect. Thank you, David. And yeah, everything you said, 100% agree with you in terms of the trade, the growth, prosperity, and I'm sure Roy on the call will 100% agree with you in terms of the opportunities in terms of airlines and how it can actually benefit the Canadian economy too. So giving the thumbs up there, beautiful. And then you've led the perfect segue as well in for me to introduce a man who needs no introduction in the UK, Daniel Hannan, who was an MEP for many, many years. Daniel, I believe is still with us. So tying on to what David was saying, why would this be beneficial for the UK to join on in terms, as David rightly pointed out, the UK just voted to leave the European Union. You more than anybody would understand the difference between the EU and what CANZUK is promoting here. So in your perspective and your expertise, what is the benefits for the UK moving forward with CANZUK as well? What opportunities lay before CANZUK in the future, going into the new year? And really and truthfully, why are you behind this? Why do you support this? So the floor is yours. If he's still there. Daniel, can you hear me? Someone in the comments has said he's got British broadband. Someone from being from Wales, I can relate to that. That's okay. So we can always come back to Daniel. That's okay. Maybe that British broadband is causing a problem for him. So Troy, I believe you might have some questions that you've been scanning. Until Daniel comes back on, perhaps you've got some questions that have stuck out to you and you think would be good to ask our panel of experts.
So yeah, we've had we've had a lot of questions come in. One of the things that's coming up is this only a conservative issue? Is this only something that conservative governments can advocate? What is the traction amongst other parties in other countries, the Liberals in Canada, et cetera, who have been, fairly good on the trade file, I think, at least in terms of advocating for trade? How can this appeal to a broader range than just small c, large c conservatives that tend to be the ones that are always talking about it? So I'll throw that open to the panel.
I'll take a first stab at this. So one thing that I noticed is that CANZUK, if we can move beyond being super partisan, where Liberals oppose it because Erin O'Toole is for it, once we move beyond that, are we going to, if that's the mindset going in, then we're in trouble. But I don't think that that's necessarily the way things have to be. But if you're like me and you run in many of these liberal circles, when the UK voted for Brexit, many armchair pundits ridiculed the British for leaving. They spoke very negatively of the people who voted for Brexit. And if those people are the liberals that we're speaking to, many of whom are in my family and who are my friends, then they can't be against CANZUK. Because if you voted for you, it's impossible to be in favor of the Brits staying in the EU and think that CANZUK is a bad idea, given the alterations between the agreement. I actually see that we have Dan back now, which is a good segue to James, your initial question for Dan before his British broadband cut out on him.
Beautiful. So Dan, yeah, good to have you back with us. I was just saying, I'm not sure how much of my initial question that you heard, but obviously David was touching on about how the UK had just left the EU. So why would they want to be brought back into CANZUK? You more than anyone would understand the differences. So really curious to hear what you have to say, given your time in the European Parliament. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Apologies for the technical problems there. Thank you and congratulations to you, James, for taking this idea and by sheer force of will, thrusting it into the center of political debate, dragging it from the fringes and making it something that people are talking about across the continents. Thank you to Troy and to Roy for putting this platform together. And let me pick up from where David left off. David, I thought, made a really good economic case for the benefits of consumer choice, trade, and the removal of obstacles between businesses and their customers, which is, I suppose, really what trade means, regardless of which jurisdiction the business is in. Let me suggest that that is a difficult argument to make even in normal times. Human beings are, I think, tribal, mercantilist, and collectivist by inclination. And free trade is a triumph of the intellect over the instinct. You know, we know it works, we can see it delivers, and that it delivers for everybody, but especially for people on lower incomes. But on a deep genetic level, it kind of feels wrong. You know, or the mercantilist case rests on a series of propositions that sound intuitive, even if they turn out to be specious. We can't compete with countries which have slave wage economies. We need to grow more of our own food. We need to protect strategic industries. We can't afford a trade deficit like this. All of those things sound plausible. All of them turn out to be untrue. And if translated into policy, they end up ruining a country. But that is, as I say, a difficult argument to win even normally. The past 10 months, I think, have been hugely disadvantageous to economic liberals, because they have, if you like, thrown people back even more forcefully on those kind of caveman heuristics. A perceived threat, an epidemic, flicks switches in our brains. It makes us want to hunker down, keep an eye on our kids, avoid strangers because they probably carry pathogens. And when you translate those things into policy in a modern world, it translates into closed schools, closed shops, closed borders. And so it is much harder to make the case for economic liberalization. I'm astonished by how many previously reliable free traders this year have been saying to me things like, well, surely, Hannon, even you can now see why we need to grow more of our own food. You know, after all, what, really? That's seriously your takeaway from the epidemic? The one thing that worked beautifully was the global market in food. And thank heaven it did, right? The worst of the restrictions hit during the period that British farmers call the hungry gap, right? It's that time between late March and early May when we basically don't produce any food. We've reached the end of the winter crops, no more turnips and potatoes and cabbages. We haven't reached the first harvest yet. If we had not been able to depend on imports from around the world, we would have been living on rhubarbs and asparagus and a bit of nettle soup, right? If anything should have shown us the value of imports, it was the lockdowns, which survived the ultimate stress test of a simultaneous global shock. And yet, you know, people think with their caveman brains, they begin with their intuitive hunch and then they rationalize it. And so that's why it is difficult to make the case for economic liberalization. And that's why we need to start with what is practical. If you are making the case for closer economic links, it is much easier when the electorate feels that the people with whom you want those closer links are not wildly more competitive than you, that their wage levels or their degrees of education or whatever are not wildly out of line with yours. And the case for CANZUK ultimately rests on, let's call it interoperability. We can agree to trust one another's regulators because we know that they've started from the same assumptions and that they will have reached similar conclusions. And we see in practical terms that this is already the case, that if you're a qualified doctor or lawyer or whatever, it's not just that you'll have had the same kind of education, you'll have probably had it at the same places and following the same norms and the same curriculum. So that's what gives us the advantage and the ability to start with something that I think is practical, achievable, and critically popular. You, James, have been running opinion polls in all of the putative members of CANZUK, and is one of the few ideas that is off the scale in terms of popularity, the idea of deeper ties among those four countries. It's almost impossible to argue against, partly for the reasons that David was just adumbrating a moment ago. So let me briefly, in the time I've got, run through what you've set out as the three key elements: free trade, free movement, and closer diplomatic, military, foreign policy cooperation. The free trade is coming. The question is, how ambitious can we be? How comprehensive, how far-reaching can we make the trade accords? Britain obviously is in the quite unusual, unique position, really, of drawing up its own trade policy after half a century of having contracted out its trade policy to a larger customs union. We've prioritized in those trade talks Australia and New Zealand, and I think we are weeks away from a pretty good gold standard trade agreement with those two countries. With Canada, the progress was slower. And I think this is partly just a function of politics, right? I think if there had been a Tory rather than a Liberal government, it would have been a little bit quicker in Canada. But the bill is now before the Canadian House of Commons for ratification, and we will have a trade deal with Canada, which largely replicates what we have at the moment through CETA, although both sides and both parties in Canada have expressed the desire to get round and improve it once that basic continuity is done. So how much more ambitious can we be? It's worth mentioning one other important piece of context here. The United Kingdom, early in 2021, will apply to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP, as it's now called. One or two of you may be wondering on what conceivable geographical grounds the United Kingdom is applying to join a Pacific trade bloc. And it is certainly true that, other than in the technical sense of owning the Pitcairn Islands, we are not a Pacific nation. But of course, we have exceptionally close ties with a number of nations that are. Most obviously Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, but also Singapore, Malaysia. And frankly, in an age when geographical proximity matters less, in the age of cheap refrigeration and storage and the internet and cheap air travel, cultural proximity matters more than physical proximity. And oddly enough, the lockdowns, I think, have tended to accelerate that trend. We're much more accustomed now to having meetings like this rather than hopping on a plane to Dusseldorf to make a presentation. So the trade-weighted argument that was so important to the people who said Europe is always going to be more important to us than our English-speaking hinterland, I think is less, to put it as neutrally as I can, is less persuasive than it was this time last year. So how much further can we go? Well, I would like to see absolute, total mutual recognition. What's legal in one of the four countries should automatically be legal in the other three. And I would like that to apply, obviously, to goods, but also to all services and indeed to professional qualifications. Now, that may sound extremely ambitious, and it would certainly go much further than the CPTPP does. But there is something close to an extant model of it already, and that is the Trans-Tasman Accords between Australia and New Zealand. They changed their name even faster than the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But let's give it the broad heading, closer economic relations, which is usually in the acronym somewhere. Basically, you spoke earlier, James, about that there is already the free movement of people, but there is also almost total mutual recognition. There is a mechanism where either party can challenge it, and it has occasionally been invoked. The Australians kept out some New Zealand apples at some point, and there was a row about at what point do alternative and homeopathic medicines need to be tested as though they were proper medicines. Do you know what? I'll take that. If that's the limit of when you don't have automatic mutual recognition, that strikes me as a pretty good deal. So one way of thinking as CANZUK, is that the UK and Canada would effectively join the Australia-New Zealand deal. We wouldn't call it that. It would be slightly rejigged. But in terms of its practical content, I think that is a realistic and worthy objective. Just that the fundamental principle, what's legal in one country is legal in the other. We would then be a core within the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I hope an inspiration to the other members to try and go further themselves. Then there's the question of free movement. And I don't think I've got much to add to what has already been said by other panelists on this. Free movement should imply the right to take a job in any of the other countries. It should not bring automatic entitlement to welfare claims, to family reunification if your family is from, or your spouse is from outside the CANZUK countries, to voting rights, although actually you already have that in the UK if you're a Commonwealth national. Those things, I'm not against any of those things, but the most important thing is the ability to take a job without a visa regime getting in your way. And again, this is incredibly popular in all of the four CANZUK countries. People very often say, oh, wasn't that what you guys had against the EU? Actually, it wasn't what I had against the EU. My beef was never with the free movement of labor. My problem was with the lack of democracy and the loss of sovereignty. But it is just a cephalogical fact, an observed point about public opinion in the UK, that whereas free movement with the EU was never popular, free movement with CANZUK is a hugely popular idea for the most obvious of reasons, which is that people can imagine themselves availing themselves of it, right? Most Brits can much more easily imagine wanting to take up a job in Canada or New Zealand than in Portugal or Poland. It's as simple as that. Let me just, en passant at this moment, since I have to say something bilingually, this being a Canadian meeting, let me, en passant, anticipate a criticism that is often made of CANZUK, and I think a false one from its opponents on the identitarian left, which is they say this is driven by nostalgia, by sentiment, it's a kind of neo-colonialism, and it's deep down racist because you know, oh, what is it that all these English-speaking white countries have in common? Ha ha ha! Right? I mean, you know, where to start with that? They accuse us of being nostalgic, and then they say things like that. The non-white population of CANZUK is far, far higher in proportionate terms than of the EU, right? Australia doesn't keep figures, but probably about 10% of the population there is not white. In the UK, it's 12, 13%. In Canada, I think closer to 20%. In New Zealand, higher still, right? In the EU as a whole, is about 6%, right? This is not, except in the fantasies and the most extreme fantasies of its critics, inspired by the desire to be with a bunch of people who look like you. It's about cultural proximity and the ability to live and work in places where the assumptions of the regulatory and economic system are shared. And I would love, eventually, other countries to come in, right? I think if your tests for qualifying, if you like, are the English language, the common law, and a level of GDP per head that would make it practicable, I think there are some obvious candidates who will be knocking at the door pretty soon. And eventually I would love this deal to take in, you know, India and all the Caribbean countries and all the rest of it. And you know, one day we may get there, but that's a question of democratic and economic progress. And, you know, that day, I hope, will come. By the way, just since this is a Canada Strong and Free event, I think one of the very neat ways of illustrating the essential appeal of CANZUK is to look at what happened, not in the most recent Canadian Tory leadership election, but the one before, when Erin O'Toole began to push this idea, the one that he didn't win. And I was very struck as an observer, first of all, by the fact that there's obviously this sort of minimum period that every Canadian CPC leadership election needs to go on for at least 21 years. But also by the fact that the CANZUK idea ended up being taken up by all of the leading candidates. And when I was looking at the results coming in, and they were all declaring for CANZUK, the surnames were, you know, Scheer, Bernier, Chong, Singh, O'Toole. You know, this is an idea that attracts people because it is practicable and because it would add value and it would bring something to all the countries. Which then brings me to the third and final aspect of it, the non-economic aspect, the strategic or geopolitical aspects of it. One of the ways in which the post-COVID world is going to be uglier is that there has been a tilt towards authoritarian regimes, as well as there being an internal tilt towards a more illiberal and authoritarian mood within all of the Western democracies. There has been a geopolitical tilt towards regimes that do not share our core values. China is one of the few countries that is already, if you like, has already outgrown where it was a year ago. The rest of us are still playing catch up. The Chinese economy, I think, is already ahead of where it was at the start of this year. Who is going to be making the case for freedom in the common law tradition? Right? The European Union today signed a closer cooperation and trade and investment deal with China, particularly aimed at boosting mutual investment. If you look at where the lineup has been over Hong Kong, over the treatment of the Uyghurs, over the Tibet, the Dalai Lama, Taiwan, any of these issues, you tend to see again that lineup of the free English-speaking democracies. So let me finish by saying that this is a practical, future-oriented project. But I'm not embarrassed, if you want to call this sentimental, by saying that I am very proud of the record that the 4 countries involved share of standing up when it counts for a system that elevates the individual above the collective rather than the reverse, and that elevates the rules above the rulers. We were on the same side when it came to defeating fascism, when it came to winning the Cold War. The history of the human race would have looked very different had those conflicts ended differently. And our task is not yet complete. That's why, in the end, CANZUK matters. I feel the best is yet to come.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dan, as well. And yeah, no doubt everything you've just said there will be music to many people's ears. And again, I appreciate all the work that you have done in the UK as well in advocating for CANZUK within your circles too. So from one, I guess you could say, from one politician in the UK to a politician here in Canada, I believe we have Ed Fast on the line. So for those who perhaps in the UK and don't know who Ed is the MP for Abbotsford in British Columbia. Ed, you as a member of Parliament here right now with us, really curious to get your take on what you feel CANZUK means for Canadians, the benefits of it for Canadians, and what you, how you see this moving forward within the Canadian political circles. So if you're able to.
James,
really
I just wanted to add, if I could,
sure.
Ed is the former international trade minister under the previous government. So just to give some context to his involvement on this file and his understanding of it. So I wanted to set that up for, not everyone may be familiar. So thanks so much for joining us, by the way, Ed.
You're very welcome, and thank you for allowing me to share some of my thoughts as well today. I think most of you know that the Conservative leader in Canada, Erin O'Toole, has made CANZUK one of the key policies within his toolkit of policies for exiting the crisis, the pandemic that we've all faced. And he is likely going to make CANZUK one of the key pieces of his election platform going forward. He has asked that I lead the effort to reach out to the key stakeholders in all 4 countries. And we've embarked upon that process with my team. The response we've received has been beyond what I would have expected, certainly positively. We've reached out to key stakeholders and interlocutors in all 3 of our partner countries, New Zealand, Australia, the UK. The response has been very positive. In fact, it's hard to find someone who pushes back on it. Now, there are some reasons why people might be reluctant to immediately embrace CANZUK, but once the whole notion of CANZUK is explained the way it's been explained today, people warm up to the issue right away. My role is also to develop a critical momentum, at least within Canada, to make sure when this effort and this project has reached a critical mass, say a tipping point, a key tipping point, that our 4 countries can move ahead with dispatch to actually negotiate an outcome that works for all four countries and takes our relationship beyond the current bilateral and plurilateral relationships we already have through TPP, through the Canada-UK agreement, through the agreements that are being negotiated between the UK and Australia and New Zealand. Why is CANZUK important? You've already heard that explained, but let me just articulate it from my viewpoint. When you look at the global environment for trade, so many of the key players have turned inward. And let me just start with the World Trade Organization, which has effectively been emasculated, partly due to the lack of contribution from the United States, which has undermined its ability to actually adjudicate disputes. But the WTO has really languished. And it's not all the fault of the United States. It's also some of the largest players in the world, the Indias, the Brazils, the South Africas, the Indonesias, which are still highly protectionist, which tend to frustrate a forward-looking consensus. So that's one of the challenges. Then we have the United States looking inward, certainly under the Trump administration. And I'm not confident the new administration will represent a significant break from that approach. We have Brexit, of course. I won't get into that, but certainly an indication of challenges when it comes to sovereignty, and as sovereignty relates to our trade relationships. There's the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia, which was supposed to include India. And a year ago, India stepped out of it for its own reasons. But again, India is highly protectionist. And the failure to have India at the table in that negotiation was a step backward, I believe, for progressive trade policy. When you look at the countries of Mercosur, which Canada has tried to engage with, has gotten really nowhere, as was the case with India. Trade discussions have languished for many, many years because of protectionism. And then there's China's increasing bellicosity and belligerence, and its unwillingness to actually follow the rules. In other words, not prepared to engage in rules-based global trade. So when you look at all of that, you still have a number of countries and economies that are forward-looking, that are pro-trade, that are in favor of freer trade, that have common values, that have a common language, in our case, the common law, that have common parliamentary systems, and a common approach to trade and investment. When you bring four countries like that together, we have an opportunity to, and I'm not going to use the term reset, but we have an opportunity to recharge support for freer and fairer trade around the world. And I'm excited about this initiative, CANZUK, because it also allows us to take it beyond trade and investment and the freer movement of people to also include strategic defense and security policy, a common foreign policy to the degree that we're able to as like-minded countries that share common values. And using CANZUK as a magnet. And I'm pleased to hear people talk about, well, what could a CANZUK Plus look like? Now that's far down the road, and I'm not suggesting that we entertain that in any way right now as we move forward as four like-minded countries and partners. But we have an opportunity to forge an alliance that goes beyond our current bilateral relationships to really signal to the world that rules-based global trade is not dead. It needs to be resuscitated, and we are going to be the example of how to do it and to do it properly. And so that's the undertaking Erin O'Toole has challenged me with, and you'll see me reaching out to many of you over the next few months. And hopefully at the end of the day, when the time is right, when the stars have aligned, we will be in a position to actually move forward with dispatch, to actually conclude an agreement that really will be world leading, that will be 21st century, and that won't have to be dumbed down to a common denominator, but actually establishes a very, very high level of trade congruence and sustainability when it comes to the global trade environment. So those are my comments, and I'd be pleased to answer questions if there are any.
Perfect. Thank you, Ed. And thank you for being here today as well, taking time out of your busy schedule. And I'm sure many people tuning in will be delighted to hear the work that you're doing. And I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody on this call, wishing you the best of luck as you continue your outreach with those countries. So thank you very much for doing that. You know, it's greatly appreciated. So Troy, we're going to go back to the questions now, I believe. Do we have any?
I'm watching participants and I'm watching time. We try to stay closer to 1 hour than too much longer than 1 hour. So I want to end with the $1 million question. I know if our founder Preston Manning's watching, he always wants this one asked at the end, and that is what do we do about it? So there's been a few questions come in, and I always think it's a great way to end a discussion like this. What are our next steps? Where do we go? And then maybe to come back to you at the end, James, is how do we support CANZUK specifically? But I'll just throw that question open. What are the next steps? What is the advice of the panelists to move this forward? What are some constructive steps? And I've seen some great stuff in the chats too about people offering to volunteer and help and lend their expertise. And I hope we're getting some of that stuff, Roy, or whoever's watching the chat. There's been a lot of enthusiasm around it. So let's end it on that note, and I'll throw that over to you, James, in the panel.
I'm happy to let our panelists go first, and I can always just wrap up at the end as well. So if any of you guys have any suggestions or way you see this moving forward, then by all means, the floor is yours.
I'll take a stab at it. I would say the quick and easy answer would be reach out to CANZUK International. It has been in the vanguard, and James has done a yeoman's job. But there are so many forums and so many opportunities. If you just look at social media, there's a groundswell of groups. I'm every day on Twitter, I'm seeing CANZUK for Devonshire, CANZUK for British Columbia. It's proliferating. And there's the wonderful thing about this movement is that it's grassroots. This is not a top-down movement. And there's opportunity in any way, shape, or form. It's gratifying. I mean, James and I have been at this long enough to know that you could probably fill a banquet hall with the CANZUK constituency at one time, and now it's greater than the population of the city that I live north of. So that was just a matter of people coming in and saying, I feel passionate about what you're doing. I'm excited about the opportunities. I have something to offer. Tell me what I can do. So just reach out to us. Reach out to any CANZUK group. And again, CANZUK International is the best place. And I'm sure James could also use the help.
With something as big as this, with 4 countries and different time zones, I'm always happy to have as much help as I can. So just touching on what Brent said there as well, there is CANZUKinternational.com is the website, and there is a section at the bottom where you can actually volunteer and help out with the campaign. And that's things from writing to your local MP to distributing campaign materials, setting up a regional supporters group, a university chapter, whatever it may be. So for those tuned in, if anybody's interested in getting involved with this and being a part of it, we're always grateful. As Brent said, it's really grassroots driven, so we're always grateful to have that help and support with that. So with the other panelists, does anybody else have any other anything else they want to say? David? Yeah.
I'd like to add one thing that's really important is the idea that we have to keep our center-right coalition accountable, and we have to keep our members of parliament accountable. And so that is on the grassroots side of this, to continue to push the idea with groups like the Consumer Choice Center, with groups like who are represented here today, with CANZUK, with members of parliament who are dedicated to continue to push this idea forward. Ultimately, we have to keep our own feet to the fire, but have to keep those external to us, their feet to the fire on this issue. And by keeping them accountable to the commitment, that can help push this forward. And so that's one thing that I would encourage for everyone who's listening, who's thinking, oh, this is great, what can I do? Get involved with James and help James keep other organizations in this coalition accountable and help keep members of parliament accountable.
Okay, let's wrap it up there. This has been absolutely a tremendous discussion. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you to everyone who participated today. One tool that will be available will be this discussion. I'll have it up and available to be linked at off our website within the next couple of hours. And I encourage you to forward it to people and spread the word. This is a great introduction to all of the issues that surround CANZUK. Next exchange call will be back on January 13th, pushback against the Great Reset. I'm hoping that we have a fantastic lineup of speakers as we start the new year. And to all of you, a very Merry Christmas, all the best of the holiday season. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again in 2021. Thank you, everyone, and bye for now.